This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Ghannam.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, after a catastrophic week in Gaza, where the Israeli military dropped U.S.-made bombs on a tent city in Rafah, burning alive 45 Palestinian men, women, and children, in fact, where children were decapitated. International outcry against the apartheid regime of Israel has not stopped it from invading Rafah. As we are speaking right now, the Israeli military is in central Gaza, in Gaza City, is in central Rafah, and is continuing its genocidal campaign against Palestinian civilians. It seems like no amount of international pressure, no arrest warrants, which have been issued by the ICC to arrest the prime minister and the defense minister, has stopped the slaughter of Palestinian civilians by the U.S. Military bombs, but by the Israeli military. The situation is very grim. And in the backdrop of that, Jamal, President Biden announced yesterday that he is promoting a ceasefire plan between Israel and Hamas. The problem is, within 10 hours of Biden announcing that, Benjamin Netanyahu threw cold water on the Biden plan. We're going to be talking about all of that today, in addition to the fact that U.S.-made weapons continue to find themselves littered throughout the Gaza Strip. And we're going to be talking about a number of investigations showing how U.S.-made weapons are actively involved in the genocide in Gaza. We're going to talk about former presidential candidate for the GOP, Nikki Haley. She flew to Israel, Jamal, and was writing on bombs, finish them off. So this is part of the Haley doctrine, I guess. In addition, White House spokesman John Kirby absolved Israel of war crimes by saying that the U.S. committed similar crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And ironically, just after he made that press conference, Jamal, another State Department official resigned because they said that the report that was generated contradicted what John Kirby said. And of course, we're going to be talking about the ceasefire proposal. It's clear that Benjamin Netanyahu has no plans for peace. Before we get to all that, we're going to watch a really important interview that you did with Jonathan Purcell. He's the Senior Public Affairs Officer for the International Center for Justice for Palestine. He's going to discuss the ICJP's role in submitting evidence of Israeli war crimes in Gaza to the ICC. It's a really important interview.
That's right, and it's very timely. And based on my conversation, the collection of evidence continues. So they're submitting it as we go, because it's almost like every single day, just Israel commits another massacre. So let's watch Jonathan Purcell. The International Criminal Court's chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, has recently declared that the Office of the Prosecutor would be seeking arrest warrants for 3 members of the leadership of Hamas, as well as both Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant, who were charged as co-perpetrators of potential war crimes in the state of Palestine. War crimes cited by Karim Khan against Netanyahu and Gallant included the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, willful killing, and intentionally directing attacks against a civilian population. The International Center of Justice for Palestine was among the legal organizations that submitted evidence to the ICC. It was collected from first-hand eyewitnesses, many of them medical professionals who had been in Gaza since October. Although the ICC received threats and pressure to dissuade it from holding Israeli officials accountable, the Office of the Prosecutor upheld the directive the court is vested with to apply international law with impartiality. Joining us today on Arab Talk is Jonathan Purcell, Senior Public Affairs Officer for the International Center of Justice for Palestine. The International Center for Justice for Palestine is an independent organization of lawyers, politicians, and academics who support the rights of Palestinians and aim to protect their rights through the law. Jonathan Purcell, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Thanks very much for having me on, Jamal.
So let me begin by asking you, how significant is the ICC's decision to seek arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant?
Yeah, so the significance of this move cannot be underestimated at all. I feel like for a long time, people have been looking at the impunity that Israel seems to have and got more and more frustrated. The international order, the rules-based system that we've come to know for decades now, has been under the most strain it's been under for a very, very long time. Many, many people in the global south and many people in the global north who disagree with their governments have been wondering if the rules-based system would be applied fairly and equally. And this is a loud and definitive message from the ICC that, in fact, yes, it will. It doesn't matter that this is a country that has enjoyed unbelievable impunity, not just since October, but for decades. Despite that, finally, the ICC is deciding to apply these rules to Israel as well. It's something that we've not seen before. And the fact that it is Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu at the very, very top of the Israeli government is something that's absolutely unprecedented and historic.
When Prosecutor Khan announced the decision to seek arrest warrants, he stated, and I'm quoting here, "I insist that all attempts to impede, intimidate, or improperly influence the officials of this court must cease immediately." There have been threats made against ICC officials, both by Israel's government and the United States senators. What has been the nature of some of these threats?
Sure, yeah. So the news that we heard prior to the prosecutor announcing the pursuit of the arrest warrants last week was actually initially in the Israeli press itself that the Israeli War Cabinet had met to discuss impending arrest warrants and to try decide what their steps should be to stop that from happening. That was then picked up in the Western press as well, in the United Kingdom and in the US, widely reported that Israel had sought the help of the US government to influence the decision, which is what led to Prosecutor Khan making that statement relatively not as opaque as it sounds. You know, he didn't mention a specific country, but it's quite clear what he's talking about, given the news that had happened, talking about these attempts to impede and intimidate and improperly influence individuals came off the back of this news about Israel asking the US to help. That being said, the nature of the US's involvement can be speculated on, and it is reasonable to speculate, absolutely, given the reports. But what we've seen even more clearly, even in the last 2 days, actually, there was a major report in The Guardian, the UK newspaper, in collaboration with Plus 972, an Israeli-Palestinian magazine. And that was very interesting because it found that Israel, not just the members of the government, but actually the former head of Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, had a long-standing campaign to influence and intimidate the previous ICC prosecutor before Karim Khan, because this investigation that's resulted in war crimes, arrest warrants now, or the pursuit of them, that actually started in 2021, because it wasn't just related to what's been happening since October. It's been the crimes that Israel has been committing for years and years. So this campaign has actually been going on for years and years it's embedded in Israel's foreign policy approach to try bend these rules. And it's something that I've said for a long, long time. Israel often tries to portray itself as uniquely targeted, that it gets singled out for unfair treatment. But in the international order, what we've seen time and time again is that actually the opposite is true. Israel uniquely gets exempted from these rules. They're the only country that is allowed to bend them time and time again. And the level of impunity that they have has given them this confidence to so flagrantly and blatantly try to influence an independent organization like the ICC. And that's exactly what we've seen in what's come out in this most recent investigation.
Because of this intimidation, was your organization concerned that Karim Khan would not bring charges against Israel's officials? I mean, you've mentioned the Guardian article, and it goes as saying that the former head of the Mossad was using language, if you interpret it, it's a physical violence, talking about the safety and talking about the safety of the family of the former prosecutor. I mean, it's like a hint of really a threat, a physical threat.
Yeah, it's really dark and troubling language. For anyone who gets the time to read it, it is astounding. But I mean, a lot of people, especially who are sympathetic, people who I've spoken to for a while, they were very skeptical that Karim Khan would pursue these arrest warrants. And I understand why, because they've become used to this system of Israeli impunity where it doesn't seem to matter what Israel does. They're not being held accountable by the international community. But actually, ICJP was always quite resolute that these arrest warrants would be issued, and was one of the few organizations saying it even when a lot of others had given up hope. And I think that that's just a faith in the rules-based order and realizing that even if these global north countries that created this international order aren't going to try to see it applied fairly and equally, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to work, because those inside the ICC have resisted these horrible attempts to influence it because they believe in these principles of justice. And in relation to other courts too, for instance, with the ICJ, we've seen global south countries taking up the mantle to apply these principles. So there is faith in the right pockets. It's just a shame that certain countries in the global north don't seem to want to play by the rules that they created. But that doesn't mean that we thought it wouldn't happen. Despite all this intimidation, despite all this lack of faith, we hoped and we thought that these arrest warrants would come.
What enabled the state of Palestine to bring these charges through the ICC, even though Israel is not a party to the Rome Statute?
This is a really important point, because often pro-Israeli commentators will try to delegitimize the ICC through exactly this route. They say that Israel's not a state party, so they shouldn't be held to those standards. But it's actually a very, very simple answer. In the mid-2010s, the state of Palestine was accepted as a member state of the ICC, and therefore the ICC has jurisdiction in any territory or state that's a member. So if war crimes and crimes against humanity are taking place in the state of Palestine, which includes the territory of Gaza, of course, then those crimes committed on soil in ICC jurisdiction mean that the ICC has jurisdiction more widely. So it's as simple as that. So regardless of the fact that the Israeli officials making these decisions are in Tel Aviv, the fact that they're happening in Gaza, that's reason enough. It's so simple.
Can you talk about the International Center for Justice in Palestine's role in submitting evidence to the ICC? For example, the kind and quantity of evidence, the methodology for collecting it. It must have been, I can imagine, an immense amount of work to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an incredible mantle to take up, unfathomable amount of work that the team had to do, but given the circumstances, it was absolutely necessary. So ICJP started submitting evidence to Scotland Yard, which is their war crimes unit, and that's the Metropolitan Police in London, in the UK. And the ICC's mechanism is that any state police can submit evidence to the ICC as well, and it can also be submitted directly to. So there's various channels where it can be done. But I think the importance of why it took so long, the quality of the evidence, the methodology, etc., is that in order for this evidence to be useful to the ICC, it has to be done to their standards. So lots of people would try to collect piecemeal evidence, but they wouldn't be able to document or produce a clear linear line from the event happening to exactly what's being put in front of the ICC investigators, which is why our team worked to British police standards in terms of methodology in order to produce this evidence. British standards correlate with ICC standards as well. So amongst our legal and investigative team includes the former police, actually, who knows the exact process and the way in which this evidence is collected by the police themselves, which gave us the opportunity to emulate the exact templates even, so that it was as easy as possible for this evidence to be transferred, so that as little extra work had to be done. And when you're producing that kind of quality of evidence, then it has a much better chance of being impactful and used for an ongoing investigation.
You've mentioned that Israel complains about that it's always been targeted when it's the opposite, when it's really kind of has a get out of jail card from these accusations. Compare the timeline of the ICC recommending arrest warrants for Israel's officials, Benjamin Netanyahu and Gallant, with that of recommending and then the judge issuing them for Vladimir Putin. Isn't this flagrant hypocrisy?
This timeline is a really interesting question. So to some extent, yes. But also, I mean, what we were just talking about in terms of the detail of the evidence collection means that I do have a little bit of sympathy for the timeline. I understand the total frustration that people thought it should be issued earlier, and especially when you look at how quickly Putin's was issued, you do wonder why. The only thing perhaps to say, just to try be fair, is that Putin's arrest warrant was restricted to a very, very specific crime in terms of forcible transfer of children. It wasn't a wider scope with multiple different war crimes and crimes against humanity. Gallant and Netanyahu have been charged with so many crimes because of how deep this plausible genocide in Gaza is, that it did mean that lots of different things had to separately be investigated. But on the topic of flagrant hypocrisy, leaving the ICC itself aside for a moment, I think the point of hypocrisy is very, very relevant when it comes to foreign governments' reaction to the ICC arrest warrants. And this is particularly from global north countries, especially, for instance, where we're speaking to each other right now. The United Kingdom and the United States are clear examples of countries that have been very hypocritical, despite the fact that they played such a big role in creating this international order and the rules that are being followed here. They don't seem to have reacted at all in the same way to Netanyahu and Gallant's arrest warrants as they did to Putin's, which they praised. So it's a shame because despite creating these rules and telling the rest of the world that this was about a system based on fairness and equality, it actually seems that these countries are using the ICC for their own foreign policy objectives rather than because they actually believe in the equal application of international law. So I think that's where the hypocrisy lies.
What will have to happen next to make these arrest warrants enforceable? If they are, what would that mean?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of where we are in the process, the prosecutor's announcement of the decision to pursue them is a massive step, but that doesn't actually mean that they're even issued yet, let alone enforceable. So we've still got some steps to go now. So now it's up to the ICC judges to take the evidence that the prosecutor has compiled and decide whether or not to issue these arrest warrants. And then once they are issued as well, they are, of course, only enforceable in countries where the ICC has jurisdiction. And that's not to downplay it in any way. It's, almost the entirety of Europe. It is the entirety of South America. In every continent in the world, Netanyahu and Gallant would find themselves with a warrant after them if they set foot in these countries. So that is huge. But of course, there are exceptions. We're speaking to you now, but for instance, the United States, not a state party to the ICC. So Netanyahu and Gallant, even if arrest warrants were issued, would be able to freely travel to the United States, for instance. So in that...
As you mentioned, most countries in Europe, including some countries that they've already mentioned, I believe Norway and France mentioned that they would abide by any ruling by the ICC. Do you expect all these countries to implement, aside from the United States and the UK, that these warrants, if they are approved by the judges, to really enforce them?
Well, even the United Kingdom, it is a state party to the ICC. So as a state party, it would have an obligation to carry out these arrest warrants if they were issued. If they decide not to, if, for instance, Netanyahu openly came to the United Kingdom and police turned a blind eye to that, that would fundamentally dismantle the very premise upon which the ICC is founded. It would make it a toothless organization that ceases to function in the way that it should. So the stakes are so high if countries don't implement this that the entire rules-based order would crumble. I think any country that is a state party, regardless of whether or not they've said they would implement them at this point, France or Norway, I think the UK and any other state party would have to as well. Of course, countries like the US, they're off the hook because they never signed it in the first place. But for the rest of the world, the majority of the world that is a member, they would simply have to implement them.
I would assume that the International Center for Justice in Palestine continues to gather evidence. For example, the recent massacre in Rafah that Israel actually admitted, to partake in it, except they're saying that it was an accident. What about other players in this genocide, aside from the head of the state, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the defense minister? I mean, there are other members of the Israeli military, the IDF, who are involved and, in fact, who have bragged about their doings and recorded videos of their actions.
Absolutely. So last week, ICJP submitted a further batch of evidence to Scotland Yard's War Crime Unit in the British Police to outline further evidence that has been collected. And that was 2 days after the ICC announcements. So we're collecting evidence all the time. War crimes have not stopped. Crimes against humanity have not stopped. And the plausible genocide has not stopped. And in fact, now we're, seeing a new intensity again with what is happening in Rafah. You mentioned the massacre on Sunday night, and there's been more massacres since targeting refugees of all people. And as you say, other members of the Israeli government and military control also risk complicity, and we would hope that further arrest warrants would be issued to them. But a further thing to say is that, especially with regards to genocide, the way that it's stipulated in the Rome Statute, and this is influenced by the ongoing ICJ South Africa investigation too. It's not just Israeli officials who are involved in carrying out these war crimes and crimes against humanity who face potential legal problems, but the complicity of other state actors means that they would risk complicity too, and it's possible that arrest warrants could be issued more widely as well to foreign state governments. So acts like providing verbal support for Israel, providing political cover, the supply of arms, which is something that both the UK and the US are still doing, even whilst other countries have stopped, and also restricting funds to aid organizations like UNRWA at a time when Israel is using starvation as a weapon of war. All of these things risk complicity by foreign state governments, and it's possible that arrest warrants could be issued outside of Israel as well. And when there is this Israeli impunity, it comes from this global network of support. Israel couldn't do what it does without the support it gets from its Western allies. And that's why it's so important that accountability doesn't just happen to Israeli government officials, which of course it should, but that it happens for the wider web that is facilitating these war crimes to happen.
Jonathan Purcell, thank you for coming on Arab Talk, and thank you for all the work here that you've been doing with your organization, the International Center for Justice in Palestine.
Thanks very much for having me on, Jamal. Really interesting to chat.
That's the voice and the face of Jonathan Purcell. He's the Senior Public Affairs Officer for the ICJP, discussing the ICJP's role in submitting evidence of Israeli war crimes in Gaza to the ICC. That's a really important point, Jamal, that in fact, that the evidence that's being collected has never stopped. There have been 2 petitions to the ICC claiming that Israel not only has committed war crimes, but continues to commit war crimes and is using starvation as a tactic and as a collective punishment. So it seems like the evidence is continuing to mount against Israel as we speak.
Well, that's why, the warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and his defense minister, Yoav Gallant, are expected to be issued despite all the pressure that they are putting on the ICC, not pressure, just even threat, physical threat. That,
no, the Mossad threatened the ICC chair, the person leading the investigation. So it was a direct threat of grave bodily injury, Jamal. It was quite outrageous.
That's right, and actually there should be, and I assume this will happen, that there'll be other people will be named. I mean, all these commanders and generals and soldiers who are not only committing war crimes, but they are documenting their own war crimes and posting them on TikTok and Facebook and bragging about what they've been doing. So moving on to what's happening this week, Jess, and this is very important. Of course, everybody knows what's been happening in Rafah and the latest massacre where Israel basically set an encampment for refugees who they've designated a safe area, set it on fire by dropping bombs there. More than 70 people have been killed, and maybe even more because we don't know all the numbers, and so many others have been injured. But the thing about it, and that's why we're talking about it, is because they've done that after the U.S. and other countries asked them not to go into Rafah, basically warning them not to go into Rafah. And at the same time, when the U.S. is asking you not to go into Rafah, it means that don't use also the U.S. supplied weapons in Rafah. I mean, we know the U.S. has supplied and continue to supply Israel with weapons as it was invading Gaza, but they made kind of like, I don't know if it's like a red line saying don't go into Rafah, which means don't go to Rafah, don't use our weapons, right?
There's no red line, Jamal, obviously.
Well, this is when I'm telling someone don't do something and then they do it. That's a red line. I mean, they specifically said don't go there into Rafah.
Well, no red line in a sense that there's no punishment. There's no accountability.
Well, that's the big question, and that's why when reporters asked Secretary Blinken about Israel is using U.S.-made weapons, he said, we don't know, we have to investigate. Well, guess what? There are investigators. There is an analysis provided by people, and also you could see it on camera, actually. CBS did its own analysis, CNN and other news outlets, where images of shrapnel gathered at the scene of that particular strike on Sunday showed evidence of a bomb that was a U.S.-made GBU-39. Not only did it show the evidence, but it actually also showed the serial number for that particular shrapnel. And they had two munitions experts that I watched on CBS News talking about it and confirming, yes, this is the U.S. bomb. This is what was dropped there, and because of this, we've said dozens of Palestinians were killed due to the subsequent fire. So now the question, Jess, because there is no red line, but we have laws, and we have the Leahy law, which specifically bans countries from using weapons to kill civilians, particularly children and women and so forth. So what do you think is going to happen about that? Since we have that actually in a law, basically.
Well, I think there's a couple of things to break down here, Jamal, and your observations are spot on. I mean, first of all, I think we need to start with the ongoing utter hypocrisy of Joe Biden, who continues to say the words that he's not going to send certain bombs to Israel, and that there's evidence that they may have used these bombs against U.S. policy. That was a couple of months ago when he said that. We know that almost immediately after he made that comment, he sent more weapons to Israel. But he made the red line, as you said, which was don't go into Rafah. In fact, the entire international community said to Israel, don't go into Rafah. What did Israel do? They went into Rafah. They literally burned 70 Palestinians to death, Jamal. They burned them to death with these U.S.-made bombs. What are we hearing from the Biden administration? Nothing, except Blinken, as you said, Well, we have to investigate. Well, more people are resigning, Jamal, because they have done the internal analyses. The reports have been made. They have said in these reports within the State Department that U.S. bombs were used deliberately to kill Palestinian civilians. And then when those reports got to Blinken and were digested for the White House press department, they were changed at the last minute. And then the other people, another individual decided that they were going to resign because they couldn't stand the hypocrisy and the way that the United States is supporting this genocide right now. So if you're asking me what's going to happen, I'll tell you absolutely what's going to happen. And I'm very confident about this, Jamal. Absolutely nothing. Biden will continue to say words, Blinken will continue to say words, but nothing will happen to hold Israel accountable for the genocide and the massacres on top of the genocide that it's committing right now. Why would we think otherwise? This war has been engaged with now for almost 9 months, Jamal. And the United States and Biden and Blinken have said this so many times. Has anything really changed? Except more Palestinians have been killed by U.S. bombs. Why? Why would anyone believe the United States? Why would anyone believe Biden? Why would anyone believe Blinken? Nothing's going to change.
Then you have a former presidential candidate, a former representative of the U.S. at the United Nations, Nikki Haley. I mean, this is not just an ordinary person flying into Israel as this massacre, just everybody's talking about this massacre, and she goes for a photo op with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Later on, she's photographed signing bombs, saying "finish them" on a bomb. What kind of image? What kind of message does this send to everyone around the world?
We know what it sends, Jamal. It's very clear. Because look at what is happening in Gaza. When Nikki Haley, who also this week said that she would vote for Donald Trump, when Nikki Haley writes on a U.S.-made bomb that's being dropped on Palestinian children, and it says, "Finish them," what she is doing and what her intentions and actions are saying is that it's okay to use U.S. weapons, and the full force of the U.S. government and its surrogates to kill Palestinian civilians. That's the message. And
a lot of people are saying that when you're in this position, Jess, and you do something like this, you're basically advocating for slaughter and for
of course,
war crimes, that you yourself should be arrested for doing so. She's not a private citizen. As far as everybody's concerned, she's nobody. She's a private citizen, and she's a private citizen. Instead of going on, people get arrested for putting messages like this on Facebook and on social media. But she goes on and she's on TV, she's everywhere, and advocating for the slaughter of children. Isn't this a war crime?
Well, Jamal, let me just ask you 2 questions. Number one, one is a statement, one is a question. One statement is hundreds of people who are protesting the genocide that Israel is committing have been arrested for protesting the genocide. And then the question for you, Jamal, is if you or I posted the same thing, what do you think would happen to us? So that tells you the answer right there, that there is this asymmetry and hypocrisy with how these things are prosecuted. I mean, I think what Nikki Haley did was unconscionable, immoral, and she should be arrested just like, everybody else who's supporting genocide right now. Is pretty outrageous, to be honest.
So the White House spokesman, John Kirby,
what a joke, man.
Actually, in my opinion, first of all, to begin with,
what a joke.
He threw the whole U.S. military. He's
under
a military person. He's a military person. He just goes on and says, basically, the United States in Iraq and Afghanistan also committed war crimes similar to those that occurred in Rafah. we committed war crimes, so let's not judge Israel. That's what basically, and I'm paraphrasing here, but
Yeah.
if anyone would like to see his video, it's all over the internet. I mean, first of all, he's saying something that the United States never admitted, even though there were war crimes and we know like what happened in Iraq, we know about Abu Ghraib and all kinds of stories. But he goes publicly. This is the spokesperson for the White House, and he's saying, we've done it. Israel is doing it now. We've learned from our lessons, or it's like he's like saying this was a teaching moment. Then it is a teaching moment for Israel.
Actually, he's saying something much worse, Jamal. He's saying some people, it's okay to commit war crimes, and for others, it's not. He's saying, yes, the United States committed war crimes, but we're not a signatory to the ICC, so we got away with it. So why not treat Israel the same way, who hasn't signed on to the ICC the same way? It is an amazing moral collapse of the U.S. government yet again. And I will say, when the history books are written, Jamal, and we look back at Biden, at Blinken, at Kirby now, for their not just complicity, Jamal, this is beyond complicity. This is active participation in a genocide that they should and will be prosecuted and held accountable in the eyes of the world when the history books are written. It's really amazing. He did admit that the United States committed war crimes, and that should be followed up.
It's really embarrassing. I mean,
it's beyond embarrassing.
Happening. It's like every single day you watch these things, and you kind of like you want to hit your head against the wall by just what you're seeing and what you're hearing from these so-called officials. And I want to go to our last story, Jess, and by now I should say Biden is used to humiliation at Netanyahu's hands. Okay?
He hasn't learned. He hasn't learned, Jamal.
So let's just go back a little bit. In early May, and he warned that if the Israel Defense Forces went into Rafah, and I'm quoting here, I'm not supplying the weapons, right? Everybody watched that. 3 weeks on, Israeli tanks rolled into Rafah, into central and western Rafah, and Gaza's, basically all over Gaza. And this area, which has been a refuge for more than 1 million displaced Palestinians. And then Biden has not delivered on his threat to curb armed deliveries. This was his threat because shortly after that, the United States sends more weapons
and more money. Yeah.
And more money because he got worried from all these Republicans and pro-Israel Democrats who were like shouting and screaming and attacking him. So when he issued his ultimatum a month ago, Biden had suggested meant that the IDF advancing to cities' population centers, that they were like playing now gymnastics with words.
Right.
Well, what is Rafah? Rafah has what population centers? They have more than 1 million people there. I mean, this is
they had almost 1.5 million people in and around Rafah, Jamal, before they demanded the next evacuation. It was outrageous. Outrageous.
So when this didn't fly, Jess, they again were wordsmithing at work here. They said, no, we didn't say that. What we meant, that the U.S. officials, now their argument that the forays so far have not been major operations. We were talking about major operations. So what Israel is doing now is not a major operation.
Oh, really?
Do they think that the entire world is just stupid, or Americans and U.S. taxpayers are idiots?
Yeah, it's a good question, Jamal. I think really the audience here is probably the legal audience, because nobody believes Biden, nobody believes Blinken, nobody believes the White House, nobody believes the U.S. foreign policy that's making some sort of claim that they're holding Israel accountable to international standards. Nobody believes that. So I think these statements are carefully crafted to create a trail for when the United States, because this is going to happen, Jamal, no matter what happens, no matter how this unfolds, no matter how it ends, the U.S. is going to be dragged, as it should be, to the ICC and held accountable for these war crimes. So I think what we're seeing is not reality. It's just gaslighting, typical political gaslighting that the United States does with Israel in trying to cover for it. But I think what's going to happen is that they're trying to create a paper trail when they are brought before the ICC for genocide, because I can assure you, Jamal, that that's going to happen. They're going to bring the United States to the ICC for complicity in war crimes. And I just want to go back to your point, which is really great. Biden has been humiliated how many times now by Bibi Netanyahu in his career? Hundreds. And he hasn't learned his lesson, right? He makes this big announcement about this peace plan and blah, blah, blah. And the next thing Netanyahu says is, well, our war strategy is not changing. So let me ask you the question. You're not a betting man, but if you were betting on the peace proposal going forward per Biden or Benjamin Netanyahu continuing to commit genocide, where would you put your money?
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu continues to commit genocide. And then this was really weird because Biden puts this tweet and he basically elaborates and says, these are the points that we reach with the Israelis: ceasefire, withdrawal from populated areas, release of the hostages, blah, blah, blah. And then Benjamin Netanyahu says as if nothing happened. And I'm assuming before you tweet that, and by the way, that his tweet was followed by a tweet from Secretary Blinken reaffirming that these are the points that they've reached. They were all on the same page. Benjamin Netanyahu comes out, and of course, Benjamin Netanyahu, after he gets beaten up by Smotrich and Ben Gvir and whatever, and he just wants to save his seat in the Israeli government, and he says, as if nothing happened. I mean, it's like a big slap in the face. And guess what? Let's add more to this. Now you have an invitation to a war criminal who has basically awaiting to get a warrant for his arrest in most countries, except of course the United States, invited by a joint session of Congress. Both Speaker of the House signed that letter.
And Chuck Schumer.
And Chuck Schumer from the Senate signed that letter, and others. They're inviting him. You remember that this actually, talking about slaps in the face, because don't forget that Biden was vice president when they did the same thing to Barack Obama when he had issues with Benjamin Netanyahu. But you have now worse issues. You have war. Even though, I mean, he's probably the most hated person in Israel, but they're just keeping him on ice now until they figure out what to do with him. He is a wanted man by the ICC, who will be soon, officially. And you're inviting him to a joint session of Congress when the President of the United States gets humiliated by
Jamal,
basically making him look like he's a liar.
I would just say a couple of things. I think more evidence for charging the United States, the president, the Congress, with crimes against humanity and war crimes to the ICC. You invite a war criminal, you celebrate a war criminal, you support a war criminal, and you support a genocide. You should be held accountable to the same standard. And that's going to happen. And, just the final point on that, Jamal, you might as well just say Donald Trump is going to be the next president. You might as well just say it. Because what Biden is doing now is undermining any possibility that people who are younger or people who are struggling with understanding why the United States is committing these war crimes with Israel, why, should they or should they not vote for him? I mean, I think it's political suicide, if you ask me, Jamal, but they can't stop themselves. It seems like they cannot stop themselves from this self-destructive trajectory.
And they cannot stop themselves from basically suckling on Apex teats. And that's why they do what they do. You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
We'll see you next week.